Questions, issues? Questions, not ready yet for this class, really soon. Working on it, promise.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
I guess, what does the Gilded Age mean?
Very good question. So, what does the Gilded Age mean? Note how gild is spelled, G-I-L-D-E-D. It is not G-U-I-L-D, which is a guild, like a craftsman's guild, like a guild of carpenters. That's not the root. Root actually, if we dropped off this and replaced the I with an O, we would have gold. So gilded means gold-plated. It's a metaphor written later by Mark Twain looking back to describe this period. And sometimes writers will describe either a contemporary period or a previous period in such a way that really encapsulates it, and that we continue to attach that name to that period. And so why did Twain call this a gilded or gold-plated age? What he meant is, on the surface, it's gold-plated. It's very beautiful. It's very fine, very refined. Like, for example, if you visited the so-called Great White City in Chicago, there was a World's Fair held there, an exposition to show off everything that was great about industrialized America and all of the great inventions of the time and the advancements in engineering and architecture. And maybe you were an upper-class woman like this enjoying the air of an electric fan and looking out over the Chicago River. But that's the outside. Scratch beneath the surface, and you might see something more like this. Immigrants crammed into a small one-room tenement apartment in New York City, or working in factories where there were no regulations on safety or sanitation and the like. And the idea is that beneath that gold-plated surface, things are pretty ugly. And so the final word here, the sort of thesis of this Gilded Age, is that America industrializes very quickly. America industrializes very quickly with very little thought given to the negative consequences of industrialization. America industrializes really quickly with very little thought given to the negative consequences of industrialization. Negative consequences of industrialization, especially for working class people.
So, two things. You're basically calling this a false golden age for our civilization, right?
Yes.
And second, isn't this basically how Dubai is now?
Yeah, with all their immigrant work and their huge Burj Khalifa skyscrapers. Yeah, it's like a modern day Middle Eastern Gilded Age there, funded through oil, which we will talk about today at some point. But first, this is the period in which America is experiencing the Industrial Revolution. So, what does that mean? The Industrial Revolution is a period of rapid industrialization. That part should be obvious. A period of rapid, or very quick, in other words, industrialization, involving the application of new technologies and scientific research to industrial production or manufacturing. I'm going to go back through it. So, a period of rapid industrialization, base part, right? Quickly industrializing. But a period during which, or involving, the application of new technologies and scientific research to industrial production or manufacturing. So, not just a period of rapid industrialization, but one that involves the application of new technologies, number one, and scientific research to industrial production, to manufacturing, to the making of things. That last part is the most important part. There's always going to be scientific research. There's always going to be new technologies or inventions. The key here is that you have a lot of them, number one, and number two, they are applied to the making of things, to manufacturing, to industrial production. Everybody got that? Okay. Well, what we're going to see is, depending on when and where we look at, and especially when, the technologies and the scientific research that are being applied to industrial production might be a little bit different. That's what allows us to differentiate between a first industrial revolution period and a second industrial revolution period. The first industrial revolution, the very beginnings of industrialization, I mentioned to you in here before. Do you remember when? I'm talking about the 4 factors that gave rise to the cotton kingdom. And not just the invention of the cotton gin, but textile mills. First in England, in the 1700s. What were the new technologies? Look at this. New mechanical looms powered through a pulley system in the rafters that allowed just 1 or 2 people to operate and produce textile, like actual fabric, for example, clothing, at such a rate as it would have taken dozens of people without such machines. So these new looms were put into these factories that are called textile mills. Yes?
What was the name of that?
That is a textile mill. So textiles are like cloth made from wool, or now cotton would be the go-to material for producing linens, bed sheets, curtains, clothing would be the number one thing probably. And there are new machines in there, mechanical looms, L-O-O-M-S.
And this was within the first industrial revolution?
Yes, this is the very, very beginnings of industrialization. This work would have previously been done in the home by individuals, and a merchant would come around and collect finished product, and they would go to a city and sell it. Now, you have people under one roof being supervised, operating these new machines with way bigger output. And they're earning, this is the beginnings of wage earning work, like hourly work. In the world's first factories, there are these textile mills. What are they using to power it? If you go back far enough, that pulley system would be powered by a water wheel outside the factory or the textile mill. It was in a river, a swift-moving stream. But the major invention of the first industrial revolution is the steam engine. So when we talk about application of new technologies and scientific research to industrial production, not just the invention of these new mechanical looms, but the steam engine, which powers them.
Didn't they use steamships during the Civil War?
Which would then be put into ships and put to all other applications, yes. So let's think on this for just a minute before we move on to the second. How does a steam engine work? It creates steam, which creates energy, which allows you to run a machine or a mechanical system like those looms that are being powered by that pulley system. You don't have to locate a factory on a river anymore. You can put it in a city, in London or Liverpool or eventually New York or Philadelphia, where it just so happens there's a lot of poor people that were willing to do that hourly work. Question?
You said the steam engine works by what exactly?
Did it what?
It works by what exactly?
Good point. I didn't finish my thought. What does the steam engine work on?
Coal.
Coal, right? So it burns coal to generate steam that can then be transferred into mechanical power energy.
Which leads to all the things with the coal mining and the horrible treatment of laborers there, and eventually Battle of Blair Mountain and all that.
Indeed, yeah. And the historians have long pondered on the question of all the places in the world where the Industrial Revolution would begin. Why England? Why Britain? It makes more sense if you study world history broadly that it would have happened in any of like 3 or 4 other places. Why England? England is blessed with the exact right mineral resources, and one of those is an abundance of coal. Speaking of the shitty conditions of the coal mine, and I know that wasn't your word, but they built these carts to run on rail systems, and they used draft animals like a donkey or a mule to carry the cart into the mines. You get the coal out of the mine, you put it in the cart, come out. And of course, the animal, like the humans working in there, would get coal dust in its lungs and die. And somewhat similar to what the point you made, someone had the thought of, why don't we replace the draft animal with a steam engine? And the locomotive is born. So railroads are built. And they realize you can use railroads and a locomotive to train to do a lot more than just get coal out of the coal mines. You can use it to connect London to Liverpool to Manchester to Leeds to Birmingham. And it can be used to transport goods and people in addition to just things like coal. And what are the rails made out of? What is the locomotive made out of? Iron. And that is another thing that England is blessed with, an abundance of coal, an abundance of iron. These are the major characteristics of the first industrial revolution. Textile mills, mechanical looms, invention of the steam engine, invention of the railroad, the locomotive, and the building of a railroad network, which would be followed by everywhere just about the building of this. What are these lines doing? This is not, we don't have electrical power yet, we're not there yet. What is this? So, if you wanted to send a communication,
Telegram,
yeah, which isn't that like
Wait, is
Russia's
it-
version of like TikTok or something?
What's that Telegram?
I'm serious. It's called Telegram.
Wasn't there an entire cable, like in Civil War time, from America to Europe? that
Yeah,
went like this?
eventually they figured out. Well, let me back up. So, what is a telegraph system? It's a system of wires across which you would send an electrical signal, and that could be received, or excuse me, could be sent out on that using a series of dots and dashes, Morse code, which correspond to letters, and they can be received on the other end of that wire and decoded and written out or typed out in a telegram and then delivered to someone. And yes, eventually they figure out how to coat those wires and run them under water, under the sea, or whatever. This revolutionizes communication. I give my imperialism lecture in world history. We talk about in the British Empire in the 1800s, early 1800s, Britain has India as one of its colonies, and it would have taken months to get a letter to India and get a response back. And by the time the world is connected by telegraph wires, it's a matter of minutes. And it is truly, in terms of communications, it's revolutionary. So, all of that is first industrial revolution, and that doesn't just happen in England. It begins there. It spreads to Western Europe. It spreads to America. Mostly, as you know, in the northern states until the Civil War, when the South is forced to industrialize to sustain itself. Now, what happens in this Gilded Age is that industrialization takes off in America, and we have new characteristics such that we talk about a second industrial revolution that begins right here. And that's mostly the subject of this lecture today. So what are then characteristics of the second industrial revolution? Well, for a direct connection's sake, not the invention of the locomotive and the railroad and the telegraph, but the development of a mass system of railroad network and telegraph network. So a massive growth in railroad and telegraph infrastructure. Interconnecting the United States like never before. Now, what about new technologies and scientific research applied to industrial production? Going back to our base definition. Let's fast forward to like the zenith of American Second Industrial Revolution production and put ourselves into the Ford Motor Company plant in Dearborn, Michigan, where there's a huge assembly line producing Model T cars. At that point, circa 1920, what is powering the heavy machinery on that assembly line? Because it's not a steam engine, or it's sure as hell not a water wheel.
Gas? Oil?
Electricity. So the key technology that's applied to industrial production in the second industrial revolution is the electric motor.
Using direct current?
Well, there's a big dispute over that between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison that ultimately leads to, I guess, the combined AC/DC that we use. I always forget which one was which, but they had a big beef over that eventually Edison won, although Tesla does get his name on a scientific unit, right? So.
And he also gets the power of the game in Canada.
And now I'm named with Elon Musk car company, right? So. Anyway, the electric motor. Now, I want you to think, what would we talk about in our national colonial lore in terms of electricity and great American statesmen? They still tell this story about Ben Franklin? Apparently not.
I mean, do you know how many Ben Franklin stories there are?
That's fair. That's fair. Ben Franklin did everything.
Ben Franklin murdered like 12 people and kept them in his basement. That's not a joke. There's like so many skeletons down there.
I've not heard that. We'll have to talk about that afterwards. I gotta know. He did do a whole bunch of different stuff. He was referred to typically in his time as Dr. Franklin. Spent a lot of time in Paris. The French loved him. What is the point of all this? Why did we go back 100 years? Famously, Franklin, who was a scientist in addition to a statesman and newspaper publisher, went out in the middle of a thunderstorm, flew a kite with a key on it with one of his sons, lightning struck, and he was like, oh shit, electricity travels down. So what? It's not like Ben Franklin discovered how to use electricity. It's not like he discovered how to generate electricity. That's the key thing here. The electric motor allows you to deliberately generate electricity and to use that to power machines, including machines that would help you in industrial production or manufacturing. Does that make sense? Electric motor. What else? Scientific research in two major fields. One, the production of steel. We will talk about this at length later, so I'll leave it at that for now. And two, the production of steel. And number two, the refining of oil. So, key characteristics of the second industrial revolution: huge growth in railroad and telegraph network. Electric motor is created and allows for electricity to power industrial machinery and many other things that we'll look at here today. And then you have huge scientific advancements in terms of the production of steel and the refining of oil. You with me? Everything good? Okay. Well, as we build, new factories and new jobs are created. That's generally in cities. And many people will move from rural areas to cities during this period, allowing for urbanization, that is the growth of cities. But also, immigrants come to America in huge numbers from new places. And unlike with the waves of immigration we looked at before, where you had Dutch families or German families coming over and settling in Pennsylvania to grow wheat on their farms, where you had immigrants coming in and establishing plantations in the South, where you have immigrants coming in and engaging in fishing in New England. Now immigrants are moving to cities in America, coming to America and moving to cities. Like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco on the other side of the country, and many more. Where are these immigrants from? Since I already mentioned that they're from
Ireland?
different places, yeah. Like you have a wave of immigrants coming over from Ireland, and not just the north of Ireland, but the Republic of Ireland, which experienced a terrible famine during this time. Where else?
China in the west?
Yeah, if you're talking about in California, thousands of immigrants from China, to a point where the American government actually passes a law that says we will not take any more immigrants from China. Also from other parts of Europe, like Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, including Italy and places like Poland, for example. And in the process, cities will grow up and out. So what do we mean by this? Anybody ever been to downtown Chicago? So, Chicago's a massive city. It's America's third largest metropolitan area, but what they call the Loop, the downtown area, is very small. And you know that real estate is at a premium. And as more and more people are living and working there, it gets overcrowded. And there was an architect there at the time named Sullivan who figured out how to build buildings taller than ever before. He invented the skyscraper, in other words.
What was his name?
Sullivan. I forget his first name, but you know, you could Google it very easily. What good am I? The key to the skyscraper is the steel frame. And when I talk about the research into the production of steel being key here, steel had been around for centuries. When the Spanish come to the New World and conquer the Aztecs, for example, they had steel swords and armor. What is steel, by the way?
It's an alloy.
It is an alloy of iron and carbon that you could strengthen by altering that mix and putting in other metals and whatnot. It was, up to this point, very tedious and expensive to produce. But with breakthroughs during this period in scientific research, it becomes much more efficient and affordable, and you could use it to not just make swords for an army, but to use in building a frame for a skyscraper. How does this work? It's like a human skeleton. Prior to this in building, in order to make a building taller, it would have to have either thicker walls or a wider base. So look at the tallest buildings in the ancient world, like the Egyptian pyramids that have like a 500-foot base in order to be that tall. That obviously doesn't work in a place like downtown Chicago. So what is the key here? The weight is not all on the bottom. It's not all supported by the foundation. It hangs off of, if you will, and is supported at every level by the steel frame, so that not every single pound of weight is resting upon a foundation at the bottom. So the steel frame is key to building skyscrapers, which allow you to pack a lot more people into a lot smaller space. Now you should think about, too, though, there has to be some other things that have to be invented for a skyscraper to be feasible. Trying to think, there's like Otis. There's like two companies that were involved in this business, and nowadays you can still see, if you get in an elevator, sometimes it's the Otis company or whatever. So the elevator had to be invented, because probably not a lot of people are going to be wanting to go up 25 floors of stairs, maybe, if you just want to get your steps in nowadays. Obviously, eventually these buildings will have electricity. We talked about Thomas Edison, who partners with wealthy individuals in Manhattan and New York City to generate electricity, not just for industrial production, but to put into people's homes and businesses and these skyscrapers. Edison obviously invents the incandescent light bulb to light up these buildings and to replace the oil street lamps on the streets of the city of New York. And eventually those power plants are built elsewhere, and cities all over the country are electrified. Obviously you needed a sewage system, toilets for a building like that, running water. If Chicago gets really cold, so you maybe didn't need AC, but you definitely needed like centralized heating of some sort, or at least radiators for remote heating and so on. All kinds of stuff that has to go into this. But cities at the same time are growing out, meaning people who could afford it are moving out of the really crowded downtown areas and into the first suburbs. Residential neighborhoods that are built, designed to be outside of the core of the city, where people could commute in, for example, by taking a streetcar, which is also powered by electricity. So you had the advent of mass transit. It allows people to live farther out from the interior of the city, and whereas cities used to be what they called walking cities, which were not much bigger than you could walk from one end to the other in a day's time, or even half a day's time, they grow much larger than they were before.
Edison started as a business on one of those trains.
Yeah, exactly. And nowadays, of course, cities have grown again and again and again and again, and we are now in a suburb. We're actually in an exurb, is what they would call it. But so, if you want to think about like Atlanta and what were the first suburbs, you would think like Inman Park or something like that, or Kirkwood or Reynolds West End,
I
maybe.
hate suburb as a term
Yeah,
because like it can be applied to suburban communities, which are urban communities that do not have the same like height and sprawl and pollution that aren't like rural either at all. Like they function like an urban communities aren't that.
yeah.
Or it can refer to cities that people think have their entire economy based around another bigger, better city.
True, that is true. Yeah,
Yeah.
you can split a lot of hairs with that, no doubt. But these cities are growing out. Another word or two on the streetcar there. I guess nobody's been to Chicago, and so you would have no reason to know this. But you know, well, let me back this up. A lot of people have been to downtown Atlanta, right? And we brought back the streetcar, and nobody rides it. It was a noble attempt to connect the King Center with Centennial Park, but have you ever encountered the streetcar down there?
No.
What?
It doesn't. In downtown Atlanta, there's a streetcar in addition to MARTA. It's kind of connected to it, but it's in the street like that. There's no like dedicated lane for it, and there'll be cars that will be in its way, and they're. I used to work in an office building downtown, and you just hear it laying on the horn all the time.
Cars have stolen the streets from us.
What now?
The streets were not designed for the cars. They were designed for people, and then these things.
And then, well, you know, horse and buggy, and then eventually we're just getting to, like you said, cars, automobiles. But look at this chaos, right? It's before.
Yeah, that's fine, because everything moved like 5 miles an hour.
That's a
No
fair
one died.
point, yeah. But there were a lot of accidents involving streetcars. And so in Chicago, what they decided to do is put it up. They elevated. They call it, and still in Chicago, they call it the L, because it's on an elevated track.
Oh, that's why it's called that.
Yeah, and in downtown Chicago, the loop that goes around it is the L, or the elevated train. Now, what else could you do, which they did first in London and England, and then in New York and Boston here, and Atlanta has one now too. It's a combination of both.
Oh, subways?
Put it underground, yeah, subway. And I mentioned sewage systems. You know, if you go back to, I mean, even like Enlightenment time, like 1700s or, you know, colonial times, cities could be nasty. You know, the typical thing was for you to have chamber pots that you could just empty out like the back or front window. And, you know, in most cities it was cool because you had like free-ranging pigs and stuff that would clean it up. At some point, though, in terms of urban growth, that's not going to work anymore. And in places like London, they had years before developed ways of channeling waste. But what they initially did was just like put it into the river downstream, which is not really, you know, environmentally cool. So the key development here was developing not just running water systems, but sewage treatment. Like figuring out scientific research into a chemical process which could treat sewage and make it not harmful to the environment, could even be reintroduced into the environment or even channeled into drinking water. Do you probably not recognize this milieu? It's changed quite a lot. This is an early 1900s era Sullivan style skyscraper. I'll show you a close-up picture of it. It is still there, but the Sullivan style is very simple and angular in the middle, but it has a very wide base with like Greco-Roman columns, and you certainly can't see this. The top is kind of adorned elaborately. But this particular location, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 roads coming in to a point. And now there's a Walgreens right there, and a big red Coca-Cola sign. And I think you can see right there, it says Atlanta, something the other. That's 5 Points in downtown Atlanta, and that is the Hurt Building. If you transfer downtown, you will probably go to class in the building immediately adjacent to the Hurt Building, which is one of the classroom buildings down there. This would be the view the other direction at 5 Points in Atlanta, and you can see this one is from when there were automobiles, and look at that chaos. There was a streetcar, and there were electric light, street lamps. That is the Candler Building. Asa Candler is one of the founders of Coca-Cola Company, which has been a world of Coke, you would know. This today is Woodruff Park. So, I mean, obviously none of these structures are there, but all those skyscrapers are there. There's actually 2 more from that era in that general area as well. The Healy Building, which if you, again, transfer downtown, you would probably eat at an establishment in the bottom of that building. And then there's a Flatiron Building. That is more contemporaneous, but pre-Walgreens. And you can see there is that Candler Building, now dwarfed by these much more modern skyscrapers like 191 Peachtree and Georgia Pacific. I worked in this dump right here at 34 Peachtree that GSU rented some space out in many years ago.
Was it worth it?
Yeah, it was. It was fun. I mean, it made me appreciate better spaces.
I remember hearing one time that the term jaywalker was used so that people would be discouraged from going in the street so that cars could go in the street.
It was a slur. Or
Yeah.
Jay was a slur.
Yeah. So yeah, which is funny you say that because there's widespread jaywalking on downtown GSU campus.
This was jaywalking was not like an actual problem. The problem was that cars were invented,
Yeah.
and because they had the ability to go fast, people wanted to do that, and so they were constantly killing people.
Yes.
And so, in order to not lose profits, there was a massive marketing campaign to basically victim blame anyone who was ever killed by a car.
There you go. Which
And
I
that's
think
why
exactly
our
what you're
roads
saying.
are the
Yeah.
way they are now.
Yeah, and you think about that too, and that's very American capitalist, the victim blaming, the jaywalker is the problem. But you imagine that during this time, I mean, all of these sorts of regulations that come to be, like speed limits and street lights and stop signs and all that, has to at some point, come into being, and it's during this period, it's trial and error almost. But also, I mentioned the massive growth of America's railroad network. The United States will far surpass Britain in terms of creating or building the world's largest railroad network. You can see that reflected here. And you can tell also it's very highly concentrated or more dense up here in the Northeast, from Boston through New York and Philadelphia down to Washington, and that makes sense. But also if you travel west through Pittsburgh and into like Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Indianapolis, you can see there's a massive concentration here in what we now call the Midwest. And at the very heart of it all is Chicago. And Chicago becomes a hub for that whole Midwestern region, connecting that major city with smaller ones like the ones I just mentioned, but also like Des Moines, Iowa, or Minneapolis, Minnesota, or Lincoln, Nebraska, Topeka, Kansas, Oklahoma City. Well, not yet Oklahoma, it's still in Indian territory. And then those cities would function as hubs of their own for their own little region, and were connected to smaller cities and towns, which were eventually connected to what we could call the hinterland, the rural areas, the farmland, the timberland. And you now have a small farm in some place like Iowa where a farmer could take his grain or livestock, have it loaded onto a railroad car, and transported to Des Moines and perhaps on to Chicago, where that livestock would be in a stockyard and eventually a slaughterhouse and a meat packing plant, and where that grain could go to from a grain elevator operation that separates it out in quality A, B, C, puts it on a railroad car, it goes to Chicago, it goes to a processed food plant and comes out as a granola bar or cereal. Which, by the way, the processed meats, the cereals, the granola bars, and not just processed foods, but manufactured goods as well, go out on the railroad spokes from those cities to smaller cities, to still smaller towns, and to the rural areas. Indeed, there are companies that come into being like Montgomery Ward and Sears and Roebuck, which will mail out catalogs for people to receive, and that they can flip through and say, what are the manufactured goods I want delivered to my local post office? And you could get not just processed foods at a local grocery store that had come from some bigger city, but also all manner of manufactured goods to make your life, easier, better, more fulfilling, to put in your home. Does that make sense? The railroad is interconnecting America like never before. The idea that you could have that intimate connection between some far-flung farm and a city like Chicago or New York or San Francisco would have been unheard of even just a generation before. And of course, this is hand in hand with the expansion of the telegraph. There were a couple of major companies that more or less monopolized the telegraph industry at one time or another. Eventually, with the invention of the telephone, which will replace the telegraph, it was the American Telegraph and Telephone Company, or AT&T. But before that, it was the company that you may well associate, at least before the Walmart MoneyGram, with moving money, and that was Western Union. Right? Yeah. So there would be a Western Union office in not just every town, but in cities like Chicago or New York, in every major hotel, around every corner. And so you could send a message from, Atlanta to Chicago in a matter of minutes. It would be decoded, and it might take a little longer for that person in the Western Union office to get that, to type it out as a telegram and go deliver it to the such and such hotel or whoever's residence or whoever's place of business. But it was damn sure a lot quicker than it would have been 50 or 100 years before, right? And since we associate Western Union now with moving money, or at least we did for a while, consider that there is an invention called a stock ticker that operates using the telegraph that is able to tick out in more or less real time the values of stocks for corporations on the New York Stock Exchange. And that way, people hundreds of miles away from said New York Stock Exchange can work with brokers to invest their money in stocks and speculate in the stock market in real time. And this allows America to grow as a corporate nation and as a consumer culture. I'm going to give you a base definition of consumer culture that we will return to in here at least 2 more times during this semester. So what is the base definition of consumer culture? First of all, the word consumer you should read in the economics sense of the word. Meaning a consumer is someone who purchases something in capitalism. Consumer is someone who purchases or buys something. As opposed to a producer that produces that thing. So a producer culture would be one in which most people produce the daily necessities of life. Food, clothing, etc. They produce that themselves. A consumer culture, in turn, then, is one in which we purchase the daily necessities of life. Consumer culture is one in which most people, if not all people, purchase or buy the things they need as opposed to producing them themselves.
I produce air by myself, and yet people still sell it.
Produce what?
Air.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm gonna sell some air halfway across the world saying you can't breathe right, have some fresh air.
Good point. I mean, even maybe you should can that. Keep in mind, though, that America is also becoming, at this time, a corporate nation. Corporations will come to dominate the American economy, and their goal is to make profit above all else.
Corporations also had a lot of free use of violence against their workers and people in the communities there.
Yeah, we're
And
gonna.
has controlled most local governments.
Yes, we're gonna get to at least some of that for sure. Maybe not today, but definitely soon.
Or even talk about the wonders.
Yes, eventually. But the point for now is that in order to make profit, corporations want to convince you through advertising and marketing that your needs are endless. So think about base definition, one in which we purchase the necessities of life. Corporations want to convince you through marketing and advertising that you need a whole lot more than just the food in your stomach and the clothes on your back. You need Pear's soap, for example. You need Kellogg's cornflakes in your cabinet. Otherwise, what kind of homemaker are you? And so on. You need all kinds of stuff out of that Montgomery Ward catalog.
And of course, you have to earn that stuff now. There's no reason anyone would ever give that to you for free, of course.
Exactly.
Regardless of how
I
much
get
it
free
is made.
cornflakes every time my auntie goes to the store.
But she has to buy them, right?
Yeah, it's free for me, not her.
Exactly. So, with that said, let's move on and talk about scientific research into the production of steel and refining of oil, with the caveat that I am no scientist, nor do I pretend to be. I will keep this very basic, not necessarily for your benefit, but in order to not look like a fool. So the production of steel, you already correctly said, steel is what we call an alloy. It is a combination of a combination of iron and carbon. But it has to be just the right ratio of iron to carbon. And it can and should be, if it's going to be of a high quality, strengthened with the addition of other things like aluminum or nickel or magnesium. To put it another way, it has to be just like the perfect sort of mix, the perfect cocktail, if you will. And prior to this period of time, that involved numerous steps of smelting or melting down the iron to produce what they call pig iron, and then to clear that of impurities by doing it once again, producing what they call wrought iron, which wasn't very strong or malleable or not very durable, to put it another way. And so you had yet another step, a third process, where you made it just the right amount of carbon, no impurities, put the other good stuff in, and by the time you're done, this is a very costly process, which makes the final product, more costly. So you have the invention of the Bessemer process, though. Henry Bessemer essentially figures out how to skip a step by piping in oxygen to this sort of bulbous looking apparatus here at just the right moment, which would allow you to do this in a fraction of the time and therefore produce steel at a much more cheap price point, if you will. That makes steel the go-to material, not just in building skyscrapers, but in replacing the iron railroads, in building the trains themselves, eventually in building the automobile will have a steel frame, bridges and other infrastructure will have steel frames, and so on. And there's a sort of steel revolution, if you will. Cities that are either already in areas of the country that have a lot of iron ore are sort of remade as steel cities, or cities pop up out of nowhere where there had been no cities because there's an abundance of iron ore, because iron is the key element. What would be, could you come up with an example of either one of those phenomena?
San Francisco and California?
Yeah, that's true. Yes. What about Eastern?
Pittsburgh.
Yeah, Pittsburgh. I've learned that it's funny. We just said San Francisco too, because I'm not a huge NFL guy. I'm more of a college football guy. But I'm like, you guys know the 49ers of San Francisco, and everybody's like, watch NFL. Anyway, the Pittsburgh football team are the Steelers. It's one of the great steel cities because in western Pennsylvania there was a lot of iron ore. Coincidentally, that's also the first place in America that oil was discovered.
In Pittsburgh?
Yeah, just around it. Believe it or not, I mean that's crazy that we associate oil in America with like Texas, right, or the American West or the Southern Great Plains. Oil was first discovered in America in western Pennsylvania and in Ohio. We just don't think about it anymore because it's all gone mostly now. But yeah, let me show this briefly. Yeah, so this area here, western PA, eastern Ohio, a lot of iron ore, and initially a lot of oil. I should say, since I mentioned there were two phenomena, either cities that already existed that were near iron ore, or cities that didn't exist. Birmingham becomes known as the Magic City because so much iron was discovered there, and the U.S. Steel Corporation sets up shop there, and they build a railroad junction. It just kind of springs up out of nowhere during this period. What about the refining of oil now? Oil, as it comes out of the ground, is known as crude oil. Crude oil is not very useful. Oil must be refined in order to be put to what turns out to be a variety of different uses. The refining of oil involves putting crude oil into a tall cylindrical vessel like this, huge, and heating it up so that it separates out into very thick, sludgy stuff at the bottom, up to thinner and thinner liquids, and eventually up to vapors at the top. You with me? Now, the key is scientific research and figuring out what could you do to those constituent parts to make that useful. One of the first things they figured out, and they being in particular John Rockefeller from Ohio, who starts an oil company that would come to be known as Standard Oil, is that you could take one of the thin liquids, kerosene, and use that in lamps, lanterns, and streetlights. So the burning of kerosene liquid was one of the first uses for refined crude oil. Now, consider though that pretty quickly during Rockefeller's lifetime, Edison partners with J.P. Morgan to build a power plant and run electricity to cities, and all of a sudden the kerosene lamp is not a big-time seller anymore. But scientists at that very time were continuing to look at these other constituent parts, and there was a byproduct that they were basically throwing away, that it was a extremely highly flammable liquid, more flammable than kerosene itself. And they figured out, well, there's these other scientists over here working on what they call the internal combustion engine. They just don't know what to use as the fuel for that engine. Oh, we could take the stuff we're throwing away, gasoline, and use that to power the internal combustion engine, which will be put into the automobile. And you can begin to see how John Rockefeller will make a fortune all over again from gasoline. And by the way, what does the internal combustion engine also need? What we just call oil or motor oil, right? To lubricate the cylinders of the engine. What were you going to say?
I was making a joke about like how I wonder why they were throwing it away. Was there anything wrong with it? But actually, you bringing up Rockefeller is a great point about the prevalence of monopolization during this time.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about Standard Oil as a monopoly in just a second. First, what are some other things? And I don't know if you can see this or not. In fact, I guess it doesn't say it up here, but in terms of vapors, butane, which can be, I mean, I guess today would be most commonly used in lighters. Propane, which is used today to power gas grills, for example. Eventually diesel fuel, jet fuel, Some of this stuff down at the bottom is eventually used to make asphalt, which becomes the base for our roadways. And some of it is used in the production of plastics, which are literally everywhere. So you can understand perhaps then why oil is so valuable, because it can be, once it is refined, used for all of these different things. And Rockefeller understood that. Rockefeller is also a terrible person. He is among the great tycoons of industry of this period, what would become known as the robber barons of the era. Of course, he makes a fortune, becomes, if not the richest man in America, pretty close to it. And in terms of business practices, he does this through, first of all, a lot of things are just morally wrong and today would be considered illegal. But in business terms, he engages in vertical and horizontal integration. In business terms, that means vertical integration means you control every step of production of a given good. So they own the land where the oil fields are, the company does. You own the rigs that are getting the oil out of the ground. You own the barrels that they're transported in. You own the refineries where that oil is treated and refined into its constituent parts and sent out as finished product.
So you said vertical integration means that you...
Thinking about it in terms of, like, if we're talking about oil, you know, there's the land where the oil exists. You own that. You own the rig that gets it out of the ground, so one step up in the process. You own the refinery, great artwork, right? Where that oil is refined, and then you own how it is transported and moved out as finished product. So going up vertically, a company controls every step of production. As opposed to if you were only a company that owned oil rigs. Does that make sense? You'd only be involved in that one step. Now that being said then, that begs the question of what is horizontal production? So what if there are other companies that have oil refineries? Buy them out. Consolidate. Run them out of business. By, for example, bribing the railroad companies to have you pay one rate and they pay another. They get in danger of going out of business and you swoop in and buy them up. So then you control all the refineries, or maybe eventually you control, or you bought up most of the oil rigs, or you bought up most of the land itself. And again, I mentioned you control by strong-arming the railroads. Once you have integrated vertically and horizontally, you've become a monopoly.
Monopoly?
A monopoly, yeah. Before it was the name of the board game, it meant a company that controls the market.
I don't know, it sounds pretty accurate. You lose everything in Monopoly real quick.
Exactly, yeah. So at one point, Standard Oil controlled like 80 or 90% of oil production in America at every level. That's bad for consumers because you can charge whatever the hell you want if you don't have competition. And eventually, Standard Oil will be forced by the U.S. government to break up into competing companies. That, as it became that monopolistic corporation, Standard Oil was so massive that when it's broken up into different competing companies, which, by the way, Rockefeller made money off of, among the companies created off the top of my head are Exxon, Mobil, Conoco, Sunoco. I'm forgetting a few, but if those names are familiar, they're all massive billion-dollar corporations of their own today. Imagine that they were one company.
Imagine if I knew who any of those people were.
You ain't ever gone to an Exxon station?
What? It's a gas station.
Yeah. Exxon, which
I
is
know
now,
what they're-
by the way, they've reconsolidated with
With
Mobil.
Never been there either.
All right, well, Conoco,
Where you think gas from?
Sunoco. There's a few that I'm forgetting, but anyway, all billion-dollar corporations, suffice to say. I can't remember if Chevron is one or not. but-
Okay, there it is.
Okay, finally. All right, good. We got to meet in the middle.
Voltron.
Nice. So these are not what we would call before in a previous era like proprietary companies that are just owned by one person. Rockefeller doesn't own Standard Oil outright. He's among the first to create what they call a trust, or a group of several individuals that constitute a board of trustees that run the company, and also among the first to sell stock in his company. So, if you have a publicly traded company, I mean, who owns that company? The shareholder, the people who own stock in it. So, I'm trying to think who's a major CEO today. The example I used to use is Tim Cook and Apple. I don't know if he's still there. But if you're a CEO, a chief executive officer, you don't own that company. What you are is someone who has been hired as an executive officer by a board of trustees who own a ton of stock in that company and have like a controlling amount of it, as opposed to like me or you who can own just a little bit of stock probably in a company who buy shares in on the stock exchange. But what this does is allow these corporations to constantly be pulling in capital from people who buy shares, and they use that to make profit and to grow and grow and grow. Now, of course, if you become a monopolistic corporation, you're like this giant monster who, as I think was alluded to earlier, you don't only have your tentacles in the oil fields and the railroad companies, but in the U.S. Congress and in the state legislature where you're manipulating lawmakers.
And of course, the worst place they could be, local governments, where
Yes.
you could get free range to murder union representatives.
Yeah, that's actually where we're headed, although I don't know that we'll get there today. But yeah, you can see that's where we're going. Could just do another 10 minutes or so. Point of departure here. At this time, in the height of the Gilded Age, if we're talking about these factories and these oil refineries and meat packing plants and the people that work in them who go home and live in the tenements or dilapidated apartment complexes in cities, there are no regulations at that time for safety and sanitation in those workplaces, in those tenement apartments. And we're talking about people who are working for wages that's barely enough to get by. And that's if they're lucky to have a job. I will mention that during this period, the Gilded Age, there are two pretty serious economic recessions. And so times are hard, and in the workplace there are no regulations for, again, safety and sanitation. I will also say things that we would perhaps take for granted today, like the minimum wage didn't exist. The 40-hour work week and overtime pay did not exist. There were no regulations against child labor exploitation at that time. And that's just the workplace. You talk about the tenement apartments that could be, built without any sort of standard or code, and somebody puts a cigarette out in the wrong place and the whole thing goes up in flames. And by the way, there's no fire escape because that wasn't required either. Or you could have a situation, for example, to tie that terrible thought back into the workplace, where some company that has women in there producing clothing on sewing machine type apparatuses decided they didn't like that these women went out and took smoke breaks. And so they locked them in the room. So when a fire breaks out, they either stay and get burned alive or jump out the window and die. These are events that occurred during this period. And there was no regulation saying, yeah, you can't lock people in a room with heavy machinery and no way to get out.
I mean, I'm not losing money if I'm dead, so.
There's some very dark thoughts today. But in fairness, it's a dark time. So, Ghettos, the first use of the word ghetto, when a lot of the immigrants that we were talking about earlier come to America and they settle in cities, they often settle either by choice or by compulsion or some combination of the two into immigrant communities that are known as ghettos. It could be a Jewish ghetto in southern Manhattan. It could be a Chinatown in San Francisco. It could be a Little Italy or a Polish quarter, whatever.
And the African American communities that were segregated via racist housing laws in the north and redlining all across the country later also got this appellation.
Absolutely, yes. We'll touch on I think all of those things, not in this lecture, but eventually for sure. That is a very good point. And so, what are you going to do about it? If you're a single worker, a single resident of one of these tenement apartments, what can you do? What happens if you go and complain to management? Get fired, get evicted, right? Worse, as we'll see. But the point is that workers begin to come together. They begin to organize into the first labor unions in American history. It's a lot more powerful if you go to management and say, it's not just me, but it's the bulk of this entire factory, or even the bulk of the workers in this city, or even in this country in a given industry that are upset about fill in the blank. And we think that you should address fill in the blank concern. And so you have the formation of groups like the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. Now, the key characteristic of the AFL for our purposes is it was what they would have called a craft union, which means it's a collection of workers associated with a particular skill. It is what we call a skilled labor union, meaning workers that were that worked in a cigar factory, that were really skilled with their hands and knew how to very carefully roll cigars. Various kinds of artisans, like electricians, for example, or a locomotive engineer, for example. These are workers that make a little bit higher wage because they have acquired a skill that allows them to do their job. That's a small fraction of the American workforce. Also, the AFL was openly hostile not just to low-wage earning, unskilled labor, but also women, black people, immigrants, etc.
It's no wonder that the industrial workers of the world are still actively recruiting today, and no one talks about the AFL outside of history class.
Yeah, so it was going to take some other organization to attempt to organize like the average American worker into the IWW, or the industrial workers of the world, sometimes known at that time as the Wobblies. Their vision was one big union for all workers, not hostile to women, black people, immigrants.
I believe their specific recruiting requirements are you the direct employer of someone else? No. Welcome.
You're welcome, exactly, yeah. So the vision to unite all workers in one big union, that alone was threatening if you're a capitalist or a corporate entity, because that had the ability to threaten your more or less universal power of your unskilled workers. But also because a lot of the leadership in the Wobblies were either immigrants themselves, some of whom carried more radical ideas, or because if you were not an immigrant but you espoused any kind of those more radical ideas, like saying that workers ought to share in the profits of the company directly as opposed to just get wages, or that workers ought to be able to appoint their managers from among themselves as opposed to those people being hired by the company. And eventually even more radical ideas than that. It may be that one or two people in the Wobblies were borderline anarchists who believe in like tearing down the government through violence. That's the kind of thing that the Wobblies unfairly get associated with. They get treated as all radicals, all a violent threat to the corporate order, And the point being that at this time, the IWW is also not highly successful in organizing the mass of American workers. The point being that we begin to see labor unions, that does not necessarily mean that instantly the mass of American workers are unionized. Indeed, today there are ongoing efforts to keep workers from unionizing, as I'm sure you're probably aware. So, yes.
I just wanted to say, you know that train that crashed in Ohio?
Yes.
I saw articles from like 2 years ago where the union workers were saying they need more stuff for the railroads because that would happen.
Shocker.
And they didn't listen to them at all.
And now here we are with a massive environmental disaster. So what is the number one tool of a union? To strike. A collective refusal to work until demands are either met or addressed. What are those demands? Typically they involve better working conditions, more safe or sanitary working conditions. As you might imagine, better pay is very often a key demand, especially at a time when there was no minimum wage. The 8-hour workday and not being forced to work 12, 15 hours a day or get fired. The 40-hour work week, which doesn't mean you don't want to work more than 40 hours, but that if you do, you get overtime, time and a half pay, or something like that. How are these demands met during the Gilded Age? Pretty much universally with violence.
My favorite.
Yeah.
Yay, Pinkertons.
Yeah. Many of these companies, I might be in trouble. Am I in trouble?
Yeah.
No.
No, do you have any PTK members here?
Is anybody here a Phi Theta Kappa member, PTK?
Never heard of it.
Well, that needs to change. It's the National Honor Society, which she and I oversee. So if you think you might qualify for said honor society, talk to me and you can join.
There's reason to want to join. I have here a letter for a PTK scholarship of, if I read this, I can see better. Hold on.
Well, I know I'm eligible if there's a scholarship involved, I'll sign up.
Exactly.
But I don't want to work for extra work.
$15,000 scholarship for University of Dubuque in Iowa.
Wow.
Hmm.
Fantastic.
And I get these letters on a regular basis, so there are many schools, and of course, Jack and Cook, $55,000.
$50,000, yeah. We Perimeter typically has one winner at least every year.
It's been two almost average.
Yeah.
We've had 3 1 year. Each campus, they could pick one. So,
Yeah. Talk to one of us if you think you qualify.
you get that 3.5.
Yeah, 3.5. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Good luck, work towards that.
Oh yeah. Thank you, Dr. Vargas.
You're welcome, thank you.
So you mentioned the Pinkertons. Back then there were detective agencies.
They did do, Pinkertons were an actual detective agency, by the way. Like, they did that.
Yeah.
It just happened to be a lot of anti-worker.
Yeah, and they end up getting used essentially to, anytime there is a strike, to violently break up that strike and allow the company to hire scabs, which are, people who are willing to come in and work regardless of the strikers and their demands,
Just, they need the money.
They need the money to feed their children, for example, and if that means working in terrible conditions for miserable wages, it's better than nothing. But the strike doesn't work if you allow the scabs to come in and get hired. So oftentimes the strikers would do violence to the scabs, and then these detective agencies, which are like armed groups being paid by the corporations, come in and in some cases just outright murder the striker.
They usually had high-powered rifles where the most the strikers would have is just a really good shove.
Yeah, and there are some infamous examples during this period and even into the 20th century of, what could be classified in a few cases as just outright murder, even mass murder on the part of these quote-unquote detective agencies.
The Pinkertons only stopped with the actual violent union busting, where there was an incident where literally 100% casualties among the Pinkertons.
Yeah.
Mostly injuries, only 3 of them died, but not a single one of them got away.
that tracks.
Yeah.
So, with that in mind, I will save and append to, and don't let me forget to append to the beginning of the next lecture, the 1894 strikes involving the Pullman strike and Cox's Army, and then the Haymarket affair.
Yeah. Another fun fact about the Pinkertons.
That's all.
They'll still sue you if you portray them badly in historical media.
Oh wow, I didn't realize that.
You know, they're around. And I feel like once you are this bad enough that you have an act based named after how bad your company was,
Yeah.
you don't get to sue people for libel anymore.
You would hope not.
Yeah.